Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we are on lesson 45 of the Acts of the Apostles, and we're covering Acts chapter 23, verses 1 through 15, and this one's called Paul the Prisoner. In our previous chapter, Luke described the riotous behavior of a mob of Jews at the temple when they saw Paul. That mob would have killed Paul if a Roman commander and his soldiers had not interrupted. This was unlike anything the Roman commander had seen before, unless he was there when Jesus was tried. Neither Jesus nor Paul would be charged with anything that was against Roman law, and we also need to differentiate between the Jewish law and the Roman law. The Jewish law did not just consist of the laws that had been given by God to Moses. In addition, rabbis had added to the laws, and as we have discussed before, elevated the man-made laws to the same importance as the God-given laws. In addition, we need to look at the Roman laws, and those laws were similar to our laws today. Until a man was convicted, there was no judgment. That means that Paul could not be struck before he was convicted. The Roman commander was in a bit of a quandary here. It is likely that he suspected that Paul had done something egregious, based on the number of people who vociferously were against him. But his preconceptions proved to be incorrect when Paul spoke calmly in perfect Greek and then addressed the Jews just as eloquently and calmly in perfect Aramaic. Paul was obviously a learned man, but still, what had he done to incite so many Jews against him? The commander had at least two requirements in court cases. He was required to give the Roman prisoner a list of the crimes he was being tried for, and the commander also needed to provide the same list to those who ranked above the commander. At this time, he could do neither. He decided that he would have the Jewish leaders try Paul, at least initially, and in so doing, might be able to find out what he was being accused of. Let's read our first passage today. Acts chapter 23, verses 1 through 10 says this. Then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. For you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? And those who stood by said, Do you revile God's high priest? Then Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest. For it is written, You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and no angel or spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Then there arose a loud outcry, and the scribes of the Pharisees' party arose and protested, saying, We find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. Now when there arose a great dissension, the commander, fearing lest Paul might be pulled to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them, and bring him into the barracks. The Jewish leadership knew that they must adhere to the Roman law, but even in front of the Roman commander, we can see the audacity of Ananias the high priest when he called for those near Paul to strike him on the mouth. What was the offensive statement Paul had made? Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. Paul was not claiming to be sinless. Instead, what he was stating simply was that he had acted on his conscience all along. What we can see in the life of Paul is as his conscience changed, so did his life and his actions. At one time, he had joined with the men who stoned Stephen. And when he did that, Paul felt like it was the right thing to do. But since the moment he was changed and confronted by Jesus of Nazareth on the road to Damascus, Paul's conscience had changed and his life also had changed accordingly. Conscience does not dictate whether we are doing right or doing wrong. In the same manner, the conscience of Ananias was to order others to strike Paul in the mouth. And regardless of what his own conscience told Ananias, he was in violation of Roman law as well as in the wrong morally. By that law, Paul could not be punished before he was convicted. And as yet, he had not been accused of a specific crime. Paul's response to Ananias, the high priest, was to the point. God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law, and do you command me to be struck contrary to the law? Jesus had referred to the Pharisees as whitewashed sepulchers. Outside of the eastern gate of the temple, in the Kidron Valley, were many tombs. Most of those were painted white, and on the outside they looked bright and clean, but on the inside were dead, decaying bodies, bones, and dirt. In this statement, Jesus was calling attention to the hypocritical nature of the Pharisees. In front of others, they looked like they were following the law, but on the inside they were dead, corpses. Jesus was making sure they understood that he knew what was on the inside, as only God can know the heart, and they might be fooling the people, but they could not fool God. Paul's statement was similar, calling Ananias a whitewashed wall. That wall was rotten beneath the paint, and this request to break the law while accusing another of breaking the law was just another example of the hypocrisy of the Jewish leadership. It is interesting that Ananias was the high priest of the Sanhedrin for 12 years, from 47 AD to 59 AD. Ananias ben Nadibius was a Sadducee. As Paul was a former Pharisee, it would make sense that Paul at least knew of Ananias and likely knew Ananias. So why does it seem here that Paul did not have a clue who the high priest was? It could have been that Paul did not recognize Ananias because of his eye problems. There's not a single verse that specifies that Paul had eye problems, but that can be inferred from a variety of verses. In Galatians 4:13, Paul said that he preached the gospel to them at first because he had a bodily ailment. In Galatians 6:11, he spoke of writing in large letters. Perhaps Paul did not realize this was Ananias the high priest because he could not see him clearly. But Paul did know the law and understood that he was not to speak against the leaders whom God had appointed, and apologized for that, even though Ananias was in the wrong. So let's think about what happened on that day. 70 members of the Sanhedrin were there to try Paul. The Sanhedrin consisted of Sadducees, Pharisees, and scribes. Of course, the scribes were the legal experts of the law, and we would think of scribes as attorneys today. The scribes were affiliated with the Pharisees. The Sadducees were the liberals, and typically occupied the higher positions, like the high priest. They were also the wealthiest members. The Sadducees, as we have discussed at length, did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. Specifically, that means they did not believe in an afterlife for anyone. But more specifically, they did not believe in the resurrection of Jesus either. Nor did they believe in anything supernatural, like a miracle, for example. And finally, they did not believe in angels. Their God was a tiny God, as they imposed many limitations on their Creator. It is also worth noting that our belief does not change God. There are many people today who begin a conversation about God by saying something along the lines of, "The God I believe in is a God of love and doesn't judge people." First of all, God's love and God's judgment are not in conflict with one another. God is 100% loving and is also 100% judging, and he is able to do both perfectly at the same time. But the other part of this that we need to understand is that it doesn't matter what God a person chooses to believe in. Our belief does not change any of the attributes of God. God made us in his image, and too many people are trying to create God in their image. The Sadducees, the liberals of their day, fell into that category. Last were the Pharisees, who also were the conservatives. Their biggest problem was that they elevated the law above the God who had given the law, and elevated their own words to the same level as God's word. Paul used these differences in beliefs to his own advantage by getting them to quarrel with one another. This should be easy for all of us to visualize. Just imagine bringing up a bill in the House or Senate. Just as senators and representatives will not cross party lines, the Sadducees and Pharisees would only agree with their sect as well. Paul went fishing, casting out this line: "Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged." Well, with one simple statement, Paul had gotten half of the Sanhedrin on his side. The Pharisees would support the Pharisee. Luke described what occurred by saying, "There arose a great dissension." Most of us have probably grown accustomed to Luke's language by now, and he is the king of understatement. For Luke to refer to this as a great dissension tells us that it was likely approaching a dissension of knockdown, drag-out variety. The Roman commander saw that his best option was to get Paul out of there. Let's read the next passage. Acts chapter 23, verses 11 through 15 says this: "But the following night the Lord stood by him and said, 'Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness at Rome.' And when it was day, some of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Now there were more than 40 who had formed this conspiracy. They came to the chief priests and elders and said, 'We have bound ourselves under a great oath that we will eat nothing until we have killed Paul. Now you, therefore, together with the council, suggest to the commander that he be brought down to you tomorrow, as though you were going to make further inquiries concerning him. But we are ready to kill him before he comes near.'" From this language, we cannot tell if Paul saw Jesus standing beside him that night, but in any case, Paul was certain that Jesus was there. He heard him. Jesus is omnipresent, which means that he can be many places at exactly the same moment. It shouldn't seem impossible or even improbable that Jesus would support Paul in the midst of this huge battle. Once again, we might see this as a battle between Paul and the Jewish leadership, but it is much bigger than that. This is a battle between Jesus and Satan. Paul, following in the will of Jesus, was sharing the gospel with the world. That makes both the gospel and Paul world changers. Interestingly, what Satan wanted the most was exactly what the Jewish leadership wanted the most: the death of Paul. That is the only way to silence Paul. Jesus told Paul to be of good cheer. Don't worry, be happy. Next, Jesus gave Paul a reminder of the mission Jesus had assigned to him all the way back when Jesus saved Paul. At that time, Jesus told Ananias, the one he had sent to Paul in Damascus, this. Acts 9:15 says, "But the Lord said to him, 'Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel.'" Well, Paul had carried the name of Jesus to the Gentiles and to the children of Israel, but had not yet testified to kings. It also is interesting that it had been on Paul's heart to go to Jerusalem for Pentecost, which is where he was arrested, and to go to Rome. Paul would make it to Rome, and that would not be the easiest of journeys either. Next, Luke described an interesting situation in which a number of Jews made a vow to go on a hunger strike until they personally had killed Paul. And that fast included drink. We can go without food for much longer than we can go without water. Typically, a person will die after 3 days without water, though it can take up to a week depending on activity. One of two things was going to happen. Either those men would break their vow, or they were going to die way before Paul did. These men, soon to be dead, or vow breakers, asked the chief priests to coerce the Roman commander to bring Paul back for more questioning. As believers, what lessons are available in this passage? Probably the most important one is that there are no promises from Jesus that our lives here will be easy. Jesus said, "In this world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world." I know this goes completely against the teaching of the prosperity gospel. Does it make sense that Paul's difficulties were because he wasn't as strong of a believer as Kenneth Copeland, Joel Osteen, Joyce Meyer, and the rest? Or maybe this was Paul's penance for persecuting the church. Okay, what about the apostles who walked with Jesus and died the death of martyrs? How did they fail and bring martyrdom on themselves instead of health and wealth? The truth is, the more we share the gospel, the larger the target grows on our heads. If Satan is not waging any battle on a person, it is because they are on his team too. The Sadducees and Pharisees were members of Satan's army. The other lesson we need to learn and stand on is that even when we are in the biggest battle, we're not alone. Jesus is with us, and that makes sense because the battle is really his. We know how the battle will end. We just don't know when. Paul's earthly battle will continue through the remainder of Acts, and he might be a prisoner of men, but he will remain a bondservant of Jesus Christ. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.